She left me at the altar with a note that said, "I never existed." And 34 years later, a young man knocked on my door, called me Dad, and told me the truth about why the love of my life disappeared. Hey folks, it's Jack Mercer here, and you're watching After Her Lies. I've got to say this right at the top because it matters. 96% of you who watch these videos aren't subscribed. That number sits heavy with me. I'm an old man telling you the real stuff, and it stings a little that so many stop by and leave without hitting that button. Do an old timer a kindness subscribe, and drop a comment. Tell me where you're listening from. It helps keep this little channel alive and keeps me going on the days when the memories get naughty. I'm 66, retired union electrician, born and raised along the Ohio River. My hands remember the weight of a ladder and the nip of cold aluminum in January. These days, they just bob in the air while I talk to you. I started this channel after my wife Linda passed, because it turns out a house gets very quiet when you're the only one in it, and you've collected a lifetime of things you still need to say. What I want to share today is the hardest story I carry. It's a love story, sure, but not the sweet, easy kind. It's the kind that eats holes in your sleep and sits heavy in your chest through 2 marriages, 3 houses, and a lifetime of Sunday mornings. It starts in 1982 at the Harbor Diner off Route 50 near Cincinnati, where the neon H would flicker until I fixed it with a scrap of wire and a prayer. I was 23, hair down to my collar, and so sure of my future I could lean against it. She was the new waitress, Claire Whitman, gray eyes with a brown fleck in the left, like somebody dropped a speck of autumn into a storm cloud. She walked like she'd never once been late, even when the bus spit her out 2 blocks down. I wasn't supposed to fall in love. I had plans. My dad had pulled cable all his life, and I was climbing the same ladder. But some folks carry their own gravity. First day she worked, she dropped a tray of coffee cups and laughed. So the cook didn't feel bad about the shard that nicked his thumb. She looked over to where I was hunched on the ladder, pointing a flashlight at the stubborn H, and she called up, "You ever think maybe it doesn't want to be seen?" "It's a letter," I said, half a wise guy. "It doesn't get a vote." She smiled. "Maybe it does. Maybe it wants to be an A." We were idiots and we were saints, the way young people can be, swapping deep truths we'd read on the backs of matchbooks. I took my dinner breaks at her counter, and she smuggled extra fries. I told her about the time lightning hit the transformer behind the high school, and it hummed like a choir. She told me that her mother collected antique gloves and never wore any of them, which felt like something you share with a person when you're testing whether you can be honest. On her 3rd week, when I'd gotten bold enough to slide a napkin over with my number, she didn't look down. She just said, "I already memorized it." We fell fast. Days got shorter and nights got long and sweet. We did things that don't sound romantic when you say them out loud. Going to the grocery store to sample grapes without buying any. Driving out to the old quarry to watch boys in leather jackets flip off the cliffs and pretend they weren't scared. Arguing about whether ketchup had a place next to steak. Her mother, she said, lived in a big house in Indian Hill and wouldn't understand me. "She thinks men like you track mud into the house," Claire said. "Men like me?" I pressed, half joking, half not. She squeezed my hand. "Men who work." I met her mother once briefly in the diner. Tall woman, perfect hair that didn't move when the door opened. She sat and held her cup like a judge rests a gavel. She looked me over, not cruel, not kind, like I was a couch she wasn't sure if she could afford. "You're Jack," she said. "What do you intend to do with your life?" "Work it," I said, because sometimes the mouth speaks before the brain. "Love it when I can, fix what breaks." Fix what breaks, she repeated, as if the words were a language she'd heard spoken but never learned. She left a better-than-average tip and told her daughter to call. If that were the whole story, boy from the river, girl from the hill, the piano versus the jukebox, it would still be a story, but it wouldn't have landed me here, talking into a camera at 2 a.m, because the past still knocks at the door. The trouble was, Claire lied to me. Not big lies at first. Little ones like pebbles in your shoe, easy to ignore if you don't admit they hurt. She told me once she was an only child. Then weeks later, she mentioned her brother had gone to Yale. She said her father had passed when she was young. Then, one afternoon, I watched her cross the street and kiss the cheek of a man who had the same jawline she did, and he put a hand on her shoulder in a way that fathers do. It should have mattered. Somehow, it didn't. I chalked it up to complicated families and let myself be swallowed by the way she was honest. The way she admitted she hated the silence before sleep. The way she cried when she found a lost dog and then laughed because she was crying. 3 months in, I asked her to marry me with a ring I bought from a pawn shop on Vine. The diamond was small and had a scratch like a comet on it, and I couldn't tell if that was good luck or a sign. She said yes right away, then put her face in my neck and shook with a kind of happiness that scared me. People who have lived around storms can smell their rain, even when the sky is blue. We set a date in June. Nothing fancy. My sister baked the cake. My best friend Marty promised a keg in the church parking lot, and the pastor told him absolutely not, which meant, of course, it would be there. The night before, Claire stayed at her cousin's apartment. She said a cousin, but I never met them because she wanted to keep things right. We kissed in the doorway like teenagers, even though we were engaged. She pressed a white envelope into my hand and said, "For tomorrow." Next morning, I woke up early, the way you do when something real is about to happen to your life. My tux felt like a costume, and I practiced tying the tie 10 times until I gave up and called my dad. He looked at me like he was trying not to cry. "You look like your grandfather," he said, and for a second I could see them both there in the mirror. Men in black suits trying to step into something larger than themselves. The church smelled like old wood and lemons. People filled the pews. The florist boy carried in the last of the flowers, and the organist warmed up, wheezing chords into the air. I stood in front and couldn't keep my knees from wanting to run. The plan was simple. She'd arrive with her cousin, we'd sing, we'd promise, we'd eat cake. It was noon when the church doors opened and a fountain of sunlight gushed in, and I turned to see her walk in and finish changing my life. It wasn't her. It was the cousin, or a woman who said she was the cousin. Hair perfect. Mascara making that careful road under each eye. She handed me the white envelope Claire had given me the night before. I tore it open. Inside was a single piece of paper with 4 words. I never existed. Claire. The cousin touched my shoulder and whispered, "She loves you." Then she was gone. If a man tells you he fainted, he probably didn't. He probably just stood very still while the world liquefied around him. I remember the organist trying to find a hymn that fit the moment and settling on nothing at all. I remember my sister's face crumpling the way paper bags crumple when you crush them into balls. I remember my father putting his hand on the back of my suit, like I was a fence post he needed to hold steady. And I remember walking out of the church into the June heat and throwing up in the rose bushes. That year, I learned how work can be the only thing that makes sense. When your heart feels like a window, you dropped on the driveway, you pick up a pair of boots and climb a pole. You swing a hammer. You don't answer questions. People love to solve other people's puzzles. They shook their heads and made guesses. She ran off with someone richer. She got scared. She had a secret. She got pregnant. Her mother forced her hand. The rumors felt like crows on a wire. I wanted the crows to speak English. I waited 2 weeks, then went to the diner. Claire had stopped showing up. The cook shrugged, said she'd always been nice, always tipped out fair. He said a man had come by once, a man in a suit, told the manager that Claire was unsafe. The manager told him to go to hell, but the next day Claire didn't show. I drove out to Indian Hill and parked across from the biggest house I'd ever seen. It had those columns that make you think of Rome and money. I sat there for an hour and watched gardeners trim roses into shapes. A woman came out, the mother, and looked in my direction like she could sense me. She didn't wave. I didn't go up. 2 months later, a rumor ran through town like fire. Claire had died in a wreck outside Lexington. The paper said a local woman, no name, car crushed under a semi. I called the hospitals and got nowhere, because I had no right to call. I stood in my kitchen and stared at the scratch of a comet on the pawnshop diamond and thought, this is how men go bitter. I didn't, not entirely. I held on to my better self by the skin of my teeth, which is a gross expression, but maybe the only one that fits. After a while, I met Linda. She had blue eyes that never tried to be anyone else's. She taught 5th grade and wore bracelets that jingled when she clapped her hands for quiet. She liked my silences and let them be. We married in a courthouse, ate pie afterward, and we were good together. That's a truth I need you to understand. Loving Linda didn't erase Claire. Loving Linda didn't fix the part of me that spun when I heard a woman laugh in a grocery store aisle and thought, maybe. But Linda steadied me. When the hair on my crown surrendered, she kissed the shiny spot. When my back began to complain about ladders, she found me a stool. We didn't have kids. It wasn't in the cards, and we made peace with that. At night, I'd sit on the porch and listen to the river's old stories, and some nights I could keep my eyes on the present. Then 2010 took Linda. Cancer. The word feels like a thief that never gets caught. After she was gone, the house became the biggest thing I'd ever tried to hold. I retired 2 years later because the clatter of a job site started to feel like a language I no longer spoke. I mowed. I learned how to cook eggs without burning them. I started talking to myself in the kitchen and thought, maybe somebody out there might want to hear this old fool tell his stories. That was the first seed of this channel you're watching. I called it After Her Lies because, as much as I tried to be the bigger man, those 4 words from the church steps kept rubbing against my ribs. Some nights I hated her for it. Some nights I missed her so bad I could taste iron. Stories like mine usually end there. Man gets left. He carries it. He makes peace. He goes soft around the middle. He dies. Except one spring afternoon in 2016 when the doorbell rang. I thought it was a package. I get a ridiculous number of packages because I like ordering the same pair of socks I always order. I opened the door and there was a young man with my father's ears. He was maybe 30, hair cut short like he cut it himself, eyes gray with a brown fleck in the left. He was holding a folder like he thought it might explode. He said, "Mr. Mercer?" "That's me," I said, and my voice decided to be brave. "I think you might be my father. You ever watch a flock of starlings turn on a dime in the sky? That's what my brain did. I invited him in like my house had been hoping to be a ship all along, and now finally had a captain. We sat at the kitchen table. He introduced himself as Caleb. He had an Ohio birth certificate, an adoption paper from Kentucky, a letter in careful cursive that looked like a school teacher wrote it, and a snapshot of a young woman outside a hospital, as if she didn't want to be seen. The letter was from his adoptive mother, Nora. She'd just passed, and in her last days, she had handed him the folder and told him the pieces she'd always been too scared to set down. His birth mother, she wrote, was named Claire. She had wide-set eyes and a way of staring straight through a lie. She'd delivered him at a private clinic outside Lexington in December of 1983, had held him and kissed his forehead, then turned her face to the wall. She had said his name should be Michael, then told Nora to call him anything she wanted if it meant he'd be safe. And then there was the detail that almost broke my chair beneath me. She told Nora to tell him someday to find Jack Mercer, the boy with the scar on his right eyebrow, who fixed the neon at the Harbor Diner on Route 50. I touched the old scar without thinking. I'd gotten it falling off my bike onto the ice on a February afternoon when I was 10. Why would she say that? I whispered. Caleb shook his head. I don't know, he said. But I've been looking. This is the third Jack Mercer I've visited. The first was 79, and a lifelong veterinarian who laughed and cried and made me pancakes anyway. The second was in Utah and couldn't even spell diner. And then I found a forum where someone mentioned they worked that stretch and remembered a kid who could make that H burn straight as daylight. We did a DNA test because the world is new like that. While we waited for the results, we ate Chinese food and tried not to read the tea leaves. He laughed like me. He rubbed his thumb on the table like me. He called Thursdays Orphan Fridays because he liked getting ahead of the weekend. The test came back a week later. 99. 97 probability that I was his father. I sat down on the kitchen floor and laughed until I cried, and then cried until I had to laugh. I made up for 33 Christmases in one afternoon by buying him the ugliest sweater in the mall. He told me about his life adopted by a mechanic and a nurse, good parents, loved, discipline, camp on the lake, a stint in the Army he didn't like to talk about. He had a son, 10, named Miller, and a daughter, 7, named June. He called me Jack for a while because the word dad felt like a new pair of boots he wasn't ready to blister in. I let him. I asked about Claire, of course. He didn't know much. He had that snapshot from outside the clinic, grainy, a shadow across her face, like she was trying to hide from the future. He said the adoption had been arranged by a woman whose name sounded made up. He'd tried to contact her and found an empty lot. He said his mother, Nora, had always believed the birth mother was running from something and that keeping the story quiet was part of the price. The past started to breathe again. I decided to go looking, but Lord, I did it like a man who'd been burned by a stove and had to cook anyway. I started with a guy I used to drink coffee with at the post office, Hank, a retired clerk. He had a key to the backside of the world, that place where mail disappears into, and he always said the old building was a museum made of dust. We still find sacks now and then, he told me, fallen behind shelves, tucked under stairs. A week later, Hank called me down there to the old branch on Court Street, where contractors were tearing out a wall to make room for a yoga studio. You're not going to believe this, he said. He held up a canvas mail sack like a magician holds a rabbit. Inside were letters sealed and stamped from the early 80s, watermarked where a pipe had leaked long ago. He spread them out like a river of paper. Some were bills, some were postcards, some were love notes. He pointed to a handful bound together with a blue ribbon, unusually careful. These got your name on them, he said. I took them home like they were warm bread and I hadn't eaten in weeks. There were 12 letters, all with familiar loops and careful lines. Claire. The first dated 2 days after our non-wedding. The last dated a few months later, early '84. I broke the first seal and breathed in the ghost of a smell that might have been her perfume or might have been the memory of it. Jack, she wrote, you can hate me and I'll deserve it. But please believe me when I say this was the only way I knew to keep you safe. I woke up on our wedding day to my mother sitting in the chair by my bed, not like a mother, more like a guard. She told me if I went through with it, she would have you arrested for statutory nonsense she would invent. She would have your father fired from his job at the plant. She would cut me off without a dime and tell anyone who would listen that you were a thief. She said she could do it because her friends wore robes. She told me to get in the car. I tried to say no, I did, and she put her hand on mine and told me about a judge who owed her favors. Jack, I believed her. I saw your life in my head, ruined by a woman's pride. So I wrote the note. I thought you would come find me anyway and we would run. When you didn't, I tried to be relieved. I am a liar, pretending she is a protector. I am so sorry. I read the letter with my elbows on the table, like I was trying to keep from falling. The second one was worse. Jack, I should have come to you with this, but I don't know how to give you news that will bind you to me. I am pregnant. I am happy, and I am terrified. My mother says I am to go away for a while. She used those words, go away. She says there is a clinic. She says it will be handled. I can't breathe. I want to run into the church and shout it loud and have everyone bless it. But if I do, she will do what she promised and ruin your life. I am a cowardly lion. I keep touching my belly like I'm asking forgiveness from a person I already love. There were more. One in which she said the doctor at the clinic reminded her of a high school football coach who thought he owned the girls he shouted at. One in which she described a flutter that felt like a hiccup, and how she laughed and then cried because she was laughing. One in which she said she had picked out the name Michael, and that she hoped he would have my laugh. The last letter was the shortest. He is here. He is perfect. I called him Michael. A woman named Nora held him and sang to him without being asked. I put my mouth to his hair and told him the truth the only way I could, that I loved him and that I was giving him what I could not give myself. I will disappear now. If you ever find this, know that every lie I told was because I believed the truth would be a hammer. I never existed are the wrong words. I exist and I love you. Forgive me if you can. Claire. I sat there a long time with the letters in my lap and the light moving around the kitchen like a dog that couldn't settle. I called Caleb. He drove over and we spread the letters on the table like a map. He held the last one in his careful fingers and went quiet in a way that made me worry his circuits were fried. Michael, he said softly. She named me Michael. We started looking in earnest then. Not because I needed to know where she lived now. Not exactly. It was more like I needed to tell the past that it didn't get to have the last word. We hired a private investigator, a woman named Renee, with a laugh like gravel and files that scared me. She dug into old clinic records, courthouse whispers, donation lists. She found a trail of money leading from Indian Hill to a private adoption agency that folded in the 90s after a scandal. She found a judge's expense sheets that suggested favors get traded with lines like retainer and clerical support. She found a woman named Margaret Whitman Clare's mother on the board of 3 charities, whose work was harder to see than their galas. Margaret had passed 10 years earlier. When Renee delivered that news, I felt something inside me unclench that I didn't want to admit had been clenched. It's a sad truth that sometimes the only thing that frees you from fear is a death notice. But Claire, where was Claire? For a while, it seemed like the trail stopped right there in that clinic's chilly hallway. And then Caleb found something I never would have thought to look for. He went to the library. I swear to you, our future is printed on old microfiche, and nobody wants to look. Caleb sat under that harsh light and spun reels for hours. September of '85, a wedding announcement in Oregon for a woman named Grace Winters, marrying an Ethan Collins. The picture was grainy, but the eyes were Claire's, and the mouth was hard in a way that said she'd taught herself not to cry in public. Renee chased it down. Grace Winters had transferred to a small college in Oregon in '84 under that new name. She'd graduated with honors. She'd married Ethan, a decent man who ran a hardware store and died young from a work accident. She had a daughter, Megan, who moved to Portland and worked for a nonprofit that handed out books to children. There was no legal proof that Grace was Claire. There was only my heart, beating 2 towns ahead of us, saying, "That's her, that's her." I took the letters with me on the plane to Portland. Caleb came. He said he wanted to carry half the weight. I don't know what I would have done without his presence at my shoulder, being the son I didn't raise but somehow knew how to stand like me. We rented a car and drove to a neighborhood with old elms that had outlived more than one set of owners. Megan answered the door. She was 30 or so, hair the color of autumn wheat, and she had a laugh in her eyes that I recognized like a song on the radio you haven't heard in years. I didn't say who I was. I said I had known Grace a long time ago. Megan looked at the letters and then at the way I was holding my breath. She took a step back and let us in. The living room had books everywhere, and a quilt over the back of a couch. The photograph of Ethan on the mantel made me like him at once, something in the way he wore a tie crooked. And then she came down the hall, wiping her hands on a dish towel, and time, which had been minding its manners, decided to get rude. Claire, older, of course, like me, wrinkles that were honest, hair almost entirely gray and worn in a braid that made her look like a girl and a grandmother at once. She stopped when she saw me, as if the floor had decided to do something that floors shouldn't. "Jack," she said, breath leaving her like a bird out a window. I have tried and failed many times to describe what that next minute felt like. The best I can do is this. When a tornado passes, there's a moment after where the birds fall silent, and then one lets out a sound like it forgot the world could be cruel. That's what my name sounded like in her mouth. We sat. Megan brought water. Caleb stood by the window, and if you didn't look closely, you might have thought he was guarding the yard. Claire put the dish towel in her lap and twisted it. She told me a life story that was half confession, half thank you note. She told me about her mother cornering her on our wedding day and about the way money buys power to make lies stick. She apologized for those 4 words on the paper. "I thought if I made you angry, you wouldn't follow me," she said. "I thought anger would keep you safe better than love could." Did you die in a car wreck? It was a stupid question, but it embodied the stupid rumor that had nested in me for decades. She laughed with her hand over her mouth because in some rooms you've got to keep your joy quiet. "I'm very alive," she said. "I did go away to Kentucky. I had our child, your son. I named him Michael, but I knew he'd have to be someone else in the world. I gave him to a woman who looked at him like he was the first star. After that, my mother's grip loosened. Maybe she thought she'd won. I changed my name and I left. I picked Oregon because I didn't know anyone there and I liked the way the name felt in my mouth. I married a kind man. I told him I had a past I couldn't open without hurting people. He said everyone does. He died early. I raised Megan. I've lived a good life and a broken one. I told her about Linda. Claire said she had watched from a distance once, after she found out that I was alive and still in Ohio. I came through town on a trip, she said. I drove by the Harbor Diner to see if that H still stands up straight. It does. I saw you with a woman on the porch of a small brick house, and I watched you hand her a sweater when the sun went behind a cloud. I went back to my motel and cried for the kindness of it. People talk about closure like it's a door. In my experience, it's closer to a window you can finally open because someone fixed the hinge. We opened it that day and the house breathed. We spread those old letters on a new table, and she cried on the last one, the way I had. Caleb didn't ask to be called Michael, but he carried the name in his pocket like a coin. He hugged her and she pressed her hand to the back of his head, the way mothers do with sons they can't get over the miracle of. We had dinner at a place with salmon that cost more than any fish I'd ever eaten, and we told stories like we were cobbling together a family tree with sawdust and faith. It wasn't all sweet. It couldn't be. I was angry. I told her so. There's no grace in pretending you're better than you are. I wanted her to have run with me instead of writing those 4 words. I wanted her to have believed I could take a punch from her mother's money and keep standing. She told me she had misjudged both me and herself, and that if she could change one thing about her life, it would be the way she let fear wear the clothes of wisdom. We said words people say when they are trying to make a bridge where a river has run too long. Some planks took, some still creak. We came home with something I didn't have before, not a second chance at the life I thought I'd live in 1983. That life is gone and deserves its grave and its flowers. What I came home with was a son and 2 grandchildren who call me Jack, and then sometimes slip and call me something closer to Grandpa. I came home with a woman out west who sends me pictures of sunsets she says I would have liked and who jokes that she's going to move here and open a place called the Second Chance Cafe. I came home with the knowledge that the lies people tell out of love can break things more completely than the lies they tell out of malice. And yet forgiveness is a stubborn weed that finds a way to grow in bad soil. There were more twists I didn't see coming. Isn't there always? Renee, our investigator, kept digging because she's a bulldog in pearls. She found out that the judge who owed Claire's mother favors got disbarred in the 90s for a mess involving campaign cash and a woman who was brave enough to talk. The private clinic now houses a pediatric practice that gives free vaccines on Saturdays and whose nurse manager wears vintage gloves sometimes, with a grin that means she gets the joke. The Harbor Diner closed in 2001, reopened as a coffee shop named Harbor Light, and the new owner tracked me down after I mentioned the old place on this channel. He asked me to come in and fix the H, not the sign. The letter carved in the back room from the old-timers who remembered. I brought a chisel and a can of paint. I made the strokes straight and true. One more twist, and maybe the wildest. Last winter I got a letter, a real one with a stamp and the smell of a stranger's kitchen. It was from a woman named Irene, who had been a housekeeper in Indian Hill in the 80s, for a family that owned too many gloves. She wrote in a hand that made me ache for Catholic school. She said she had been young and needing money, and she had seen things that made her question things she now knew were plain wrong. She had held Claire when she cried in a pantry that smelled like lemons. She had driven those letters to the post office because she had promised a girl she'd do it, and she had wept when she read in the paper about a wreck near Lexington and thought the girl was gone. I have carried the weight of what I did not do, she wrote. I am sorry. I am old now and want to lay some of it down. I wrote her back. I told her weight is a funny thing. How sometimes you only know you were carrying it when you set it down and your hands begin to shake. I told her I forgave her for not being able to be a hero in a house that punished heroes. She wrote again and said she forgave herself because she had learned that when you are offered the gift of forgiveness, the right thing to do is unwrap it and not put it on a shelf. What do you do with a story like this once you know it's yours? I tend to garden, I guess. I call my son on Tuesdays and ask about his kids' school projects. I keep a suitcase half-packed in case the grandchildren text that they made the finals in a spelling bee. I talk to Claire. She goes by Grace everywhere but with me, and we laugh about that in the evenings sometimes, comparing the way the light falls different on the Ohio River than it does on the Willamette. We try to visit, another one, and it went well until I brought up the old house on Indian Hill and all the locks went back on her face. Healing eludes us one day and sits in our laps the next. I don't know what the ending is, and maybe that is the mercy here. The lies that moved my life were dressed in expensive clothes. They came from a woman who believed you could buy the truth a new outfit and no one would notice. They came from a scared girl who looked at a man she loved and saw, wrongly, a life she would ruin by being brave. The truth, when it finally came, did not arrive with trumpets. It came in a mail sack, dusty and late, and in the voice of a young man at my door, saying a word I never expected to hear again in a way that made my knees go weak. I know some of you are going to ask in the comments whether I ever told Linda about Claire. I did, in a way husbands do when we are trying to be better than we are. I told her I had a scar in my heart that she didn't make and couldn't fix, and that I loved her with all the space that wasn't occupied by a ghost I couldn't bury. Linda nodded like the teacher she was and said, "We love with the space we have, and sometimes the space grows." She made it grow by being kind. When I told Claire that later, she cried for a woman she'd never meet. So if you're one of those folks holding two truths in your lap, loving the person in front of you while a shadow follows you into the kitchen, I see you. Sometimes the only thing we can do is set another plate and be honest about who else is eating. If you're young and you're listening, let me be the old man who tells you the thing you might not want to hear. Tell the truth, even when it shakes your voice. Tell it before the mail gets lost behind a wall, and you have to wait 30 years for someone with a crowbar to find it. If you love someone, and if you're scared it will ruin them, tell them anyway and let them stand next to you and decide. Trust the person you picked more than the fear that dressed up like your mother's wisdom. And if you are the one who has been lied to, ask yourself if you can forgive the frightened child inside the adult who hurt you. It won't fix everything, but it will fix the part of you that wants to freeze time to keep yourself from being hurt again. Here's the part where I talk to you like I'm talking to myself in the mirror while I tie a tie I should have learned to tie by 66. This channel, After Her Lies, is as close as I can get to a second chance at telling things right. It means the world that you sit with me in this kitchen and let me lay out my letters. If you've got a story like mine, even a little, or if you've got a question you don't think you can ask anyone else, drop it in the comments. I read them all slowly and carefully, like they might be the one that lets me sleep, and please, please subscribe. I know I said it at the start, but it still stands. 96% of you aren't subscribed. That number makes me a little sad, like I'm telling these secrets into a wind that doesn't know my name. Hit the button, ring the bell, scribble your name under mine. It lets me know that the birds are singing again after the storm and that you'll be here next week when I pour coffee and try to tell the truth.